We have to recover those islands. It is important that aggression does not succeed. We've seen enough of it already. If this one succeeds, there'll be other examples of it elsewhere.
Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has announced he has sacked the commander-in-chief of the country's armed forces. That news just coming into us because the dismissal follows weeks now of speculation over General Valery Zaluzhny's future after the leaders became embroiled in an argument over strategy.
President Trump has fired the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. General C.Q. Brown was nominated by former President Biden in 2023. His term was supposed to run until 2027. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth also fired Admiral Lisa Franchetti, the first woman to ever serve on the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
Lord Stirrup, very, very warm welcome to you this afternoon. A former fighter pilot like myself, but you've got a far more aircraft under your belt than I ever did. Strike Masters, Jaguars, Phantoms. You ended up being the most senior man leading our Royal Air Force from 2003 to 2006, and then was selected to be Chief of Defence Staff, very pinnacle of defence from 2006 to 2010. So I can't think of anybody better to talk to us about that sort of very strategic level of defence, the tensions between sort of military and political. But a very warm welcome to you this afternoon.
Thank you. Good to be with you, Sean.
Yeah, so just a first question to get us into this. I mean, I think I'd reflect that many of our politicians today are inherently short-term. They're looking to the next general election for getting re-elected, whereas defence feels like it needs long-term investments, long-term planning. So given that when sporadically, most notably at the moment with Ukraine and potentially, obviously, Gaza, these things crop up, what is the relationship between the very pinnacle of defence and our political masters? Is it robust? Is it testy? Because we don't see any of it, but we do rely on it to be pretty robust conversation.
Well, of course, I can't speak for the present, but I can speak for the past. And I would say, certainly in my experience, the relationship is robust. The relationship between the most senior military officers and the politicians is an extremely important one because, well, for two reasons, really. First of all, because, of course, we live in a parliamentary democracy which has civilian political control of the military. And, of course, that's, the system that we fight to defend. So that civilian political control means that there has to be a very effective interface between the politicians who are exerting control and the military who are carrying out their instructions. But the second reason is that if you're a good Clausewitzian, as I am, then you'll believe that almost all military operations have at their heart a political objective. Almost all wars begin and end in politics. So military officers should never be politicians, they should never be political, but they do have to understand that the eventual strategic end state will be a political one, and they have to ensure that any military activity, any military campaigns are aligned with and contribute to that political outcome, because if they don't, then the whole thing becomes totally pointless.
No, but it's interesting. So pick up your Clausewitzian analogy. You'll also know that he always talked about the triumvirate of the people, the politicians, the military, always being with a degree of tension about them because the public want defending, the military pay in blood for adventures, whereas the politicians at times can appear self-serving. And that's why in some countries you end up with military coups. Now, I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that that's where we go, but it does highlight the fact that there should be a constructive tension there. Absolutely, it has to be led by the politicians, but behind closed doors, particularly nowadays when it doesn't appear the military are allowed to talk to the media at all, you rather have to trust the fact that there are some pretty robust conversations going on there.
Well, indeed so, but that has always been the case. I mean, one of the examples that people always cite is that of Alan Brooke and Churchill, and Alan Brooke's, very robust discussions with Churchill, and the arguments, some of which he won and some of which he didn't. But of course, nobody knew that at the time. Nobody really knew that until Alan Brooke's diaries were published years later, because those arguments took place in private, as they have to. As a senior military officer, interfacing with the political level, you have to make the military case, and you have to make it robustly. And I can tell you from my personal experience, I've had many robust discussions, debates, if I can put it that way, in Number 10, some of which I won and some of which I didn't. But they all took place in private, as they have to, because it's rather like, for any military officer, think of a military commander and his or her own subordinates. If that commander's got any sense, then they will discuss issues with their staff and their subordinates, and they'll listen to a variety of opinions. But at the end of the day, they will have to make a judgment and make a decision. And once the decision is made, then they expect the subordinates to fall into line and follow it, not to keep arguing against it. And it's exactly the same at the political military level. Once the politicians have made their decision, they are the elected representatives of the people whom we serve. Once that decision has been made, you only have two choices. One is to get right behind it and do your utmost to carry it out. Or if it is a matter of such moral significance to you that you cannot live with yourself, if you follow it, then you resign. And then, of course, you can say what you like. What you don't do is stay in post and continue to argue against it and undermine it. No military commander would accept such an approach from their own subordinates. And why should they expect it to be any different with politicians? But those robust discussions must take place before the decision is made. And I can tell you they do.
Yeah, the reason I'm pushing a bit on this is that it feels it's almost like a first amongst equals type of relationship. But I remember when I joined, when you were in sort of more your formative years, we had about 4 or 5 4-stars, and I do remember a couple of them, without naming them, being rather intimidatory, rather scary characters that I wouldn't want to get the wrong side of. And you sort of had confidence that they would close the door with a politician and be very robust about their line, even though they would do exactly as you said, respect the confidence of what happened in there. Today, we have 1 4-star in the Royal Air Force serving, and that seems to be more of a political appointment. I'm just wondering whether, and also you'll be aware that the military has been rusticated away from MOD out into the shires. All of those things seem to create an environment where it puts a little bit more power into the hands of the politician and a little bit less influence in the hands of the military.
Well, I think I would look at it from a slightly different perspective, not so much balance between military and political, but the balance between military and civil service. And my own view is that the rustication of the chiefs from London was a mistake. And it was a mistake because it altered the balance of day-to-day advice between the military and the civil service. And I don't say this, in any way as a sort of anti-civil service point, because I've worked very closely with civil servants throughout my career and have huge respect for them and everything they do. But they're not military officers and they can't give the military advice. So I do think that from that perspective, the move of the chiefs out of London was a mistake. But at the end of the day, with regard to the point you're making, which is the balance between military and political, that interface has always been confined to a very small number of people, if not one person. For example, in the Second World War, very largely Alan Brooke. Okay, the other service chiefs were involved a bit as well because we didn't have a CDS in those days. But it was very much down to Alan Brooke to take the lead. So I think that that hasn't really changed significantly. It's the other balance that I just referred to that I think has been affected and is worse now than it certainly was in my time.
Turning to, because one of the interfaces, obviously the Defence Secretary, I think, was it Dr. Liam Fox was the Defence Secretary during part of your time as CDS?
Well, I had 5 during my time as CDS, and he was the last one.
Yeah, so they do chop and change, which is partly to my point. But how important do you think is a military background to a CDS? I'm looking forward and going that Ben Wallace's tenure was quite long. He did seem to be carry a lot of popularity within the military, but actually that's not what it's about, is it? I'm also thinking that Pete Hegseth, the US Defense Secretary, made a lot about the fact that he was a serving military. Is that important to have had a lot of military experience, or do you think actually you should be relying on a defense secretary who's just very effective at the political level and relies on the chief of the defense staff for military expertise?
I don't think a military background for the defense secretary is crucial at all. There's only one thing worse than somebody that knows nothing about a subject, and that's somebody who knows nothing about it but thinks they do. So one has to be aware of that. The role of the defense secretary is not to make military decisions or to run the military. However, of course, the defense secretary needs to have a certain insight into the military, into how they operate, into how they think, into what they do. He doesn't need, or she doesn't need, a military background to be able to do that, but they do need some continuity in post, because in the first few months it's a very steep learning curve. I've seen defense secretaries with no military background who've done an excellent job, but it's taken them a good 6 months to get to grips with the military environment, and indeed, of course, with the Ministry of Defence, which, let's face it, is one of the more baroque ministries in Whitehall. For all of us who go there for the first time, civilian, military, politician, whatever, it takes us a little while to understand the working of the department. So I think the thing we've got to guard against is actually changing the defense secretary too quickly, which certainly happened in my time. That was on occasion a serious problem.
One of the things about the military is that it seems to be your military capability is a deterrence. I'm talking about small d rather than nuclear deterrence now. And part of that is you've got to have the capability, but you've clearly got to have the intent to use it as well. We've been involved in wars of choice rather than in expeditionary warfare for the last 3 decades or so, where it's been a bit of discretion, and one might argue that political adventurism has formed part of that. How do we reset that datum? How do we make sure our political masters have the robustness to recognise that our deterrence value is as much a robust political stance as it is military capability?
You're right, of course, that political will is an important part of deterrence. The involvement of Western nations in the war in Ukraine, the indirect involvement, the support for Ukraine, has, I think, demonstrated a degree of will and determination that rather surprised Putin. The issue is not really, I think, whether we failed to do enough in Ukraine to bolster our deterrence credentials, if I can put it that way. It's what we failed to do before that led Putin to imagine that the West was too weak, too lily-livered to do anything about his takeover of Ukraine as he saw it. So your point is absolutely right, but I would focus further back, and I take us back to 2014, and that's where we really made the mistake in not standing up to Putin aggressively then, in not increasing Western defense budgets substantially at that point. Had we done so, we might not be facing the situation in Ukraine that we are today.
I'm interested because there is an interesting point of where you start the clock in this, about 2014, 2022 or whatever. There is a view, because I'm interested that you said, yes, Ukraine's not a member of NATO. But what was your take on our moral, if not legal obligation, given that the 1994 Budapest memo was a guarantee of Ukrainian sovereignty in return for giving up nuclear weapons? And, I think I went out to Ukraine about 3 months ago for a week, and I'm back out again in 3 weeks under my own steam. And one of the things that was played regularly to me was that we're very grateful to the West, but actually, what on earth happened? We expected you to fulfill your obligations under that memo. What's your take on that?
Well, I don't think our obligations included, going to war if the undertaking was broken. So I don't think we failed in our undertaking. I do think that by not taking military action in 2014. But I do think we failed, not just in our undertaking in terms of international agreements, but in our own national self-interest in failing to respond robustly enough at that time. There were many, many other measures that were available to us that we could have taken, short of actually declaring war on Russia, which clearly would have been a very, very serious act on our part. But we failed. And because we failed then, we're in the situation we are now in Ukraine. As ever, the later you come to your decision to act robustly to create a deterrent situation, the harder it becomes.
I guess that's what circles me back to the sort of earlier point, really, is that no politician will want to go to war. I mean, let's face it, nobody wants to go to war. In the interwar years, there was a massive public vote, we'll never go to war in the continent, and within a few years we did. I just wonder whether the political leadership were given military advice that said exactly what you're saying, that said, we've got to be careful here, because I understand your reluctance to get involved militarily, but the longer this goes on, the more difficult it will be to resolve it. Do you get a sense that that conversation happened, or do you think that's just the way our democratic system works?
Well, I can't say whether that conversation happened in the official corridors of power at the time. But I certainly said it, as did many others, and said it in public. So politicians can't say they weren't warned. And of course, the debate about our response to these international pressures and international challenges can't just be confined to offices in Whitehall. It's a wider parliamentary issue, and there were parliamentary debates at the time. There were public statements at the time. I made a number myself, pointing out the dangers that we faced, pointing out the fact that we faced basically a gangster regime in Russia, and that if we didn't stand up to them, then we would rue the consequences further down the line. And such has proved to be the case.
Can we segue now onto something that I think has been pretty close to your heart if I look back your time, and that's funding for NATO. We've entered an era where, Trump in his first presidency made pretty clear he was unhappy that, notwithstanding the size and scale of the US defense budget, that actually if NATO was going to live under the protective umbrella of that, then everybody should pay their way. And at the time, I think only a third of NATO members did. Prompt 2.0, we've now got 2/3, but it still seems to be the conversation is around who can make 2% or not. What's your take of the American position at the moment, President Trump? Do you think he's preparing to walk away from NATO? Do you think he's trying to scare NATO to spend more money? Well, let's just start there. What is the American agenda here, do you think?
Well, if I could see accurately into the mind of President Trump, I wouldn't be here today talking to you. I'd be earning a lot of money with other people. I don't think anybody can forecast exactly what the US intentions are, let alone how events will play out. But Trump's stance in his first presidency that Europe wasn't spending enough on defense was absolutely right, as many have said for a long time, and it's just as true today. We have to remember that 2% of GDP was put there as a floor. That's FLOOR, below which people should not go, not as some sort of target people should aspire to in the longer term. The fact that far too many people were below it, and some still are, speaks very poorly for those individual nations. But of course, 2% was drawn as a floor in different days when we weren't facing a horrific war in Europe, a renewed Russian threat to the peace and security of the continent. The situation has changed fundamentally because we didn't respond appropriately in 2014 when we might have got away with 2.5% or something like that. We're now going to have to do much more. 2.5% is wholly insufficient. I mean, I point out that during the first Gulf War, which was after the Cold War, when we were involved in a conflict, which was the last time when we fielded an armored division in conflict in earnest, and which stretched us to the utmost in some cases, we were spending 4% of GDP on defense. As recently as 2010, we were spending 2.6% on defense. And taking into account the accounting changes that have taken place in the interim, that's probably more like 2.7, 2.8% in today's money. So, 2.5% still would not take us back to where we were in 2010, where we weren't facing this situation in Europe. So we have to realize that we're in a completely different situation. I've had all sorts of interesting discussions with people, not the usual suspects, not people like me, who say, I don't like it, but I see no alternative. We've got to get serious about this. And we really do. So far, the government has shown no real appetite to do so. That may be changing. We shall see. But we have to see the change not just in this country, but throughout European NATO, if we are to respond adequately to the challenges of today and tomorrow.
Can I just pick up on that point then? So there's been a lot of talk by the government about sort of NATO first. I don't want this to be about the current UK government position, because obviously it's a bit speculative. But the point about, how much should our nation rely on alliances for protection? And therefore we are vulnerable, particularly with changes of a US administration, versus what national capabilities should we have? It seems that ideally we'd have national that we can also commit to NATO, but we've currently got huge capability gaps that we used to have in the Cold War when you and I did our sort of formative years. And actually 2.5%, 3%, whatever the number is, isn't going to get that bow wave sorted out. It feels like there's a huge investment that needs to happen to plug these gaps. And then there's a conversation about how much you have as an enduring commitment to defense. So what's the balance, do you think, between NATO versus national?
Well, this country has always relied upon alliances for its security. You go back to the stately quadrille in the 18th century, the Concert of Europe in the 19th century. So there's nothing new in that. We rely upon collective security, and NATO is the current expression of that collective security. The problem is not with NATO per se. The problem is that the European members of NATO have not done enough since the Cold War to keep it at a sufficiently high level of capability to face the challenges that have emerged in this century. And we and other European members of NATO have gone down pretty much the same path. And here I think, the American administration, not just Trump administration, but successive administrations, criticism has been fair, which is we have essentially drawn down our defense in order to fund ever-increasing levels of health and social security. If you look at the UK public expenditure picture at the moment, we spend about 4.8% of our public expenditure on defense. You spend over 40% on health and social security. Now, we're all very keen on health and social security, and we all know the challenges that the NHS faces. And my son is a doctor. I'm only too well aware of them. But there's a question of balance here. And it doesn't matter how good your healthcare and social security are if you are not secure as a nation. And so, the kind of changes we're talking about suggesting to the defense budget, if, for example, we were to go up to 3% of GDP, which in my view is the minimum we should be aiming for over the next several years, we'll be moving defense from about 4.8% to around 6%. So we would be looking at a transfer from other areas, probably from social security, of about 1.2% of total public expenditure. Now, that's not a huge shift, but of course, I accept that any change is going to be painful because it's going to mean reduction somewhere, and they're always painful, and they're always difficult, they're always challenging. But frankly, we have no choice if this nation is to be secure in the years ahead, and other NATO nations have to face up to the same challenge.
I guess again, this talks to a point that I think the NHS is a really good example, that all of us, whether it's through relations, family, friends, understand the pressures on the NHS when, you know, I've got friends who've been in A&E, friends who've suffered from cancer treatment or whatever. There's huge pressure. You feel it. So you can understand when the government puts more money there. In defence, I don't think there's really an understanding from the population about where these pressures are, a sense of how dangerous it is out there. And of course, our serving military can't talk to the media. And therefore, the only voice for that is through our politicians who, as you say, if they're faced with difficult choices, the electorate might stop voting for them if you see less money being diverted into NHS. How do we get that conversation out about just how important defence is, how vital it is? Because if you don't pay your insurance premiums, then you can't expect the cover that defence provides.
Well, I think it is happening. And interestingly, a lot of politicians are pushing that message. The reluctance up to now, of course, has been within the government. And the government is composed of politicians, but not all politicians are in the government. And the government is the body that will have to take the extraordinarily difficult choices that will have to be made. But I do think that there has been a sea change in the overall political and public opinion in this country as a consequence of what's been happening in Ukraine. That's not, in my view, the problem. The problem is that it didn't happen in 2014 when it should have done, when it would have been easier and cheaper to deal with. And so the question for me is, how do you keep people focused on the need, as you put it, to pay your insurance premium in the weak piping times of peace, when they've got all these other priorities? But that's a problem we have faced over the centuries, and I don't see any easy fix to it. I don't think it's just because a lack of the military voice, because, as I say, it's not new to this age. I think it's just something we have to continue to struggle with. And I'm afraid in a democratic society like ours, we'll always face up to these issues too late. And as a consequence, it will cost us much more than it should have done.
Well, yeah, fingers crossed that we wake up. I mean, returning to that, I think what's interesting, though, we've very topically at the moment, the Prime Minister is looking at potential, how do we support Ukraine? And one of the options was boots on the ground with the security forces type thing. Over the last few years, there's been a bit of conversation about no-fly zones. And I understand, obviously, you and I are both former fighter guys. We understand that sort of there are risks associated with that as well. But it does feel odd that actually, if we are going to deter Russia once some form of peace happens, that air power is one of our asymmetric advantages against Russia. And therefore, rather than putting large land footprints, which has dominated the headlines at the moment, do you think there should be more conversation about the potential for us to just extend what we're doing around the airspace around Ukraine to actually extend into Ukraine, which might limit the risk for our British government, but also potentially give us a significant advantage and deter Russia over Ukraine?
Well, that's an important discussion, but I think we're getting ahead of ourselves. Not you and I, but certainly on the news programs. And you might reflect on this in Sky News. We've got no idea what kind of deal there's going to be, if any. Clearly, as part of this, there will have to be some kind of assurance to Ukraine that if it signs up to a settlement with Russia, then what it's left with will have, a degree of security. But I've got absolutely no idea at the moment what shape that sort of agreement might take. Everyone's talking about putting boots on the ground. We have to understand what that means. What that, you have to, when you suggest these things, you've got to go through all the what ifs and follow them through to their logical conclusion. And I very much hope that this sort of thing is going on in the Ministry of Defence today, as it should be. What happens if we have British troops on the ground in Ukraine, or indeed British aircraft flying in the skies over Ukraine, and the Russians launch another offensive and attack and kill British troops, shoot down British aircraft? we are then, I suppose, at war with Russia. Now, is that a NATO war? Because it wouldn't be Russia attacking a NATO member. It would be attacking our forces in a non-NATO country. So are we then, as the UK, on our own, or whoever else might be involved in such a peacekeeping force, at war with Russia, with all the potential consequences of that? We have to think all of that through. So I am certainly not in a position to suggest any kind of model for I won't say a security guarantee, because there is no guarantee, but some kind of security assurance or reassurance to Ukraine. But it's going to be much, much more difficult than anyone is at present suggesting.
No, I agree. And in a way, that's probably why I asked you the question, because we seem to be fixated sometimes with numbers of troops on the ground. And, certainly in my time, I did 3 tours, 2 years of my life in Afghanistan. And I'm not sure our nation start to understand why 454 people didn't return from that. So we lost a lot more people with arms and legs. There is a price to pay for particularly troops on the ground. And if you're feeling the heat of Russia, the countries around that are probably feeling the heat even more than we are. And therefore, I'm not saying we should abrogate our responsibility, but there are other ways that we can contribute to that, which wouldn't necessarily mean taking a leading role on the ground.
Well, all that's true, but I don't think we should predicate our response on what we think would be least risky to us. The risk, of course, has to be a very important factor in our consideration, but effectiveness also has to be an important factor in the consideration. So I think we've got to look at all of that in the round. And as I say, I couldn't possibly say what sort of shape or size such reassurance to Ukraine might take. But what I would say is that we need to think it through very, very carefully indeed, including all the what ifs and the potential consequences, because it's no good, wanting to halfway through to pick up your ball and say, I'm fed up with this game now, I'm going home. Once you're in, you're in.
I'm interested as well, though, because there is a logic, and I'm going to counter myself here a bit, that when I was in the MOD, and probably in your time as well, the 2 primary driving threats were China and Russia. And in my Cold War days, we were planning one-way missions, weren't expecting to come home. There is an argument that says Russia's military capability today has been decimated, not only militarily, but also in terms of credibility as well. And therefore, actually, arguably, they no longer present a threat to the rest of Europe than potentially we have planned for in the past. How would you assess Russia's threat to Europe now, based on those 2 sort of potentially conflicting metrics?
Well, it depends what we do. It depends what we do with regard to Ukraine. I think if the war in Ukraine were to go on for another couple of years, then I'm told, and I'm not an expert, so I can't verify this, but I'm told that Russia's overall economic and fiscal position will be dire, which of course will seriously hinder their efforts to rebuild military capability and to pose a threat in the immediate future. If, on the other hand, the fighting stops pretty quickly in Ukraine, which of course is in one way what everyone wants, then the Russian economy will recover that much faster. But I think we must bear in mind that although Russian military capability in terms of both equipment and people has been written down significantly through combat in Ukraine, it can rebuild those. And we must remember that things like its nuclear forces, its long-range aviation, with which you and I are very familiar, its air power in the round has really not been affected all that seriously, if at all, in some areas. So it still retains considerable capability. It's also learned a lot of very important tactical lessons. I mean, its performance in the first year in Ukraine was utterly shambolic. But it's clearly learned a lot of important tactical and operational lessons. And we have to remember that people tend to learn rather more from defeats than from victories. And we also have to remember that although it might be some time before Russia could mount a serious, significant threat to NATO, we have also depleted our already small stocks very significantly in support of Ukraine. So a fully armed, fully trained, capable NATO can take on and can deter Russia. It's not in a position to do it at the moment. It could be in a position to do it when it needs to, when Russia has rebuilt its forces, provided it gets going now. But there's no time to waste.
Thank you. The last question I have really relates back to you talked about if we do decide to commit forces, that we have to think through the risks. I was reflecting the other day that, my son flies jets in the military today, but chatting to him, the risk appetite has changed fundamentally since your and my era. I reflect back that I was part of a force where we had 3 accidents a year. We lost 1 pilot a year, and that was out of a force of about 65 people. We were focusing on, the Cold War. We were expecting not to come back at the end of missions. And even if stuff didn't work in the cockpit, you were focused on just getting on with it. The weather might not be perfect. You get on with it. It feels like today there's a very different risk appetite. My son's not been to a funeral. He's not seen his jet, anybody crash that jet yet. And I do wonder, that's great from a safety perspective. As a father, I'm delighted. But I do wonder whether or not that we've been sort of in a way dominated by wars of choice, and therefore a very much higher, a lower appetite for risk, a higher focus on making sure we don't have accidents. Do you think this new paradigm needs us to make a different assessment of the way that we prepare, train military forces, and extend that not just to our air force, but obviously to forces training on the ground?
Well, I think there are 2 dimensions to that question, Sean, and I'm not sure they're strictly related. Like you, I'm delighted that the accident rate in the Royal Air Force is so low, because it lessens the risk to our people, but it also preserves our equipment. We want it for the day when you need to fight, rather than having them scattered all over the country in crash sites. So that's great. I don't think that equates to a lack of willingness on the part of our young people who man the military in all 3 services to put themselves in harm's way if the circumstances require. I think if you look throughout history, that's always been the case. I remember during the operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, the willingness of young people to go out and do difficult and dangerous things was just as great as it's ever been through our history. So, there's been no change in the genetic makeup there. But what I do think has changed is the level of training that they undergo in preparation for large-scale peer-on-peer conflict. The kinds of exercises that you and I are familiar with, were familiar with in our time, hardly ever happen. And it's not just a question, frankly, of the young people who man the cockpits and the ships and the tanks and the infantry battalions. It's also the whole command structure and the political structure over that. When was the last time we did a Wintex? Going back to what I said at the beginning, all of this, will be in pursuit of a political objective. So, the political oversight of the military and the political strategic direction of the overall campaign will be crucial. And politicians have to understand that. And they also have to understand the risks. And they also have to understand, the losses that are likely to occur if we get into such a situation. And I fear that they've got far too little exposure to that. And going back to one of the questions you asked earlier, that kind of exposure, even in exercise terms, focuses their mind on the requirement for deterrence and the avoidance, if at all possible, of having to make those extraordinarily difficult decisions. So the more we can get back into that large-scale exercising for military and politicians, the better.
So, but part of that is we seem to have drifted more towards exquisite. I know it's a term that's a bit evocative, but around military capability. But you hail from a time, when we did close air support with Strike Masters, effectively, at a completely different end of the spectrum in terms of technology. But quantity has a quality all of its own sometimes in conflicts. And do you think that risk appetite? It's one thing having exquisite platforms, but you can't afford many of them. Do you think that we're inevitably going to see a shift towards having more quantity of some of this stuff, not just high-end quality?
Well, I think that's probably true when it comes to unmanned vehicles. I think that's where we're likely to have to look in future for mass. But I'm very wary of these arguments about more cheap stuff rather than fewer expensive things. It's absolutely no good sending up your pilots in gladiators to face ME-109s, no matter how many gladiators you've got, because they're all going to get shot down. So it's a question of overall effectiveness. That's what we've got to look at. And the requirement for mass is an important one, but it's got to be a mass that's still effective in getting the job done. Because if it's not, then it's a waste of money. What good was the Russian steamroller in 1914? Had plenty of mass, but the mass turned into mass casualties. So I think that we've got to be very careful about that. It's an important discussion to have, but it's also important not to let it slide too far to one side or the other.
Lord Stirrup, I could have talked to you about this stuff for literally hours. It's a huge privilege. Thank you so much for your time today, and thank you. You've had a lot of time of service. You're an absolute icon for us who've served in the military, and it's a unique insight. Thank you into sharing some of the insights into that strategic level of defence. Thank you.
Well, it's been a pleasure, Sean. Thank you for having me, and let's hope we can get the direction of travel right over the next few years.
Perfect.